For over 6 centuries, one empire shaped the course of history, an empire that brought down Byzantium, stood at the gates of Vienna, and once commanded 3 continents. But how did it rise, and why did it fall? In the year 1299, deep in the heart of Anatolia, a small tribal leader named Osman I unknowingly laid the first stone of an empire that would soon stretch its reach across Europe, Africa, and Asia. Osman's tribe, just one among many in the fragmented remnants of the Seljuk Empire, would go on to conquer lands, forge alliances, and face challenges that none could have predicted. The future he unknowingly set in motion would become an empire built on ambition, innovation, and relentless military conquest. But this rise came at a price that would eventually turn their own power against them. What was once an unstoppable force would eventually meet its reckoning, a tragic fall, leaving the world to ask, could it have been avoided? From the conquest of Constantinople to the Golden Age under Suleiman the Magnificent, to the battles that defined Europe's future, the story of the Ottoman Empire is one of grandeur, triumph, and eventual collapse. This is the story of how the Ottoman Empire, a force so great it shaped the modern world, rose, and how it ultimately fell. In 1299, in the rugged lands of Anatolia, a man named Osman I led a small but fierce group of warriors, unknowingly setting the stage for one of history's most powerful empires. Imagine this, a time when the Byzantine Empire, once a mighty force, was crumbling. The Ottomans weren't just a kingdom, they were a wildfire, quickly spreading across the region, fueled by the spirit of the Ghazi warriors, a group driven by a blend of fierce Islamic faith and the legendary tactics of their Mongol ancestors. Osman wasn't some grand emperor in waiting, he was a tribal leader, with no more than a few hundred loyal men. Yet, in a world where empires fell at the edge of a sword, Osman's ambition didn't just whisper of conquest, it roared. His Ghazi warriors, mounted on swift horses, were experts in lightning-fast raids. They would strike hard and fast, retreating before the Byzantine army could catch them. It wasn't about brute force, it was about smart, hit-and-run tactics that slowly chipped away at a once mighty empire on the brink of collapse. These Ghazi warriors weren't just soldiers, they were believers, motivated by something far deeper than power. They fought for a cause, for faith, for glory. The Ottomans weren't just spreading Islam, they were spreading a new way of life, a new vision for the future. They blended the Mongol military prowess with their Islamic faith and Turkic traditions, creating something uniquely Ottoman. And for Osman and his warriors, it wasn't about just surviving, it was about expansion. Fast forward a few decades, and Osman's son, Orhan, was about to take the reins of this growing force. In 1326, Orhan captured Bursa, a major Byzantine city, and made it the first Ottoman capital. Imagine that moment, the Ottomans, once raiders, now rulers, setting the foundation for a mighty empire. And it wasn't just about capturing land, it was about building. They didn't just conquer cities, they transformed them, making them part of the very fabric of the empire. But it wasn't all smooth sailing. The Ottomans didn't have the resources of a massive empire like the Byzantines. What they had was innovation. They used light cavalry, archers, and siege tactics, tools that the Ottomans would master over time. They didn't just raid, they conquered intelligently, using the best strategies of their enemies and improving upon them. They learned, adapted, and evolved faster than anyone could have anticipated. Now, as powerful as they were, the Ottomans didn't just rely on military might. No, they understood the importance of organization. They weren't only creating an empire by conquering lands, they were building systems, establishing trade routes, and creating a legacy that would spread far beyond the battlefields. They weren't just expanding, they were organizing an empire from the inside out. But here's where it gets interesting, this focus on innovation that helped the Ottomans rise to power would later come back to bite them. Their strength was in their adaptability, but as they grew, their rivals did too. Other empires and rising powers began to catch up, learning from the Ottomans, and challenging their dominance. The very strength that helped the Ottomans rise would eventually become the reason they would have to defend it, again and again, until their empire finally crumbled. Osman's dream had started with a small, nimble band of Ghazi warriors, but over the next few generations, the Ottomans would become unpredictable, unstoppable, even uncontainable. By the time Orhan took Bursa and made it the capital, their name was beginning to spread beyond Anatolia. They weren't just a tribe, they were the future of the region. From this moment, Osman's descendants would build an empire whose influence spanned continents. But as they expanded, so did the challenges. The first cracks would begin to show, the toll of their rapid rise, the innovations they pushed forward. These cracks would shape the very empire that seemed unstoppable at the time. Because the road to greatness wasn't without its cost, and as the Ottomans expanded further, the question became, how long could this empire hold on to its power? What would be the true price of an empire that conquered with both sword and soul? Let's rewind to the year 330 AD. A city was born, one that would stand as the jewel of the Eastern Roman Empire, a city so immense and fortified that for over 1,000 years, Constantinople was considered impregnable. It wasn't just any city, it was the heart of a powerful empire, a symbol of strength, wealth, and the unyielding will of the Byzantines. The Theodosian walls were legendary, designed to withstand sieges, with towers so high they could look down upon any would-be invader. It seemed impossible for anyone to breach it. And yet, in 1453, a 21-year-old sultan with an unshakable ambition was about to prove the impossible was possible. That was where Mehmed II came in. He was known to history as Mehmed the Conqueror. At the tender age of 21, Mehmed had already been groomed for greatness. His father, Sultan Murad II, had led the Ottomans to territorial expansion, but Mehmed had bigger dreams. He wasn't interested in just being another ruler, he wanted to secure his place in history by taking down the last vestige of the ancient Roman Empire. The Byzantine Empire, clinging to life, stood in his way. And in 1453, Mehmed declared war. But this wasn't just another battle, this was going to be the siege of a lifetime. April 6, 1453, marked the beginning of the end for the Byzantines. Mehmed's forces, numbering in the hundreds of thousands, surrounded Constantinople, cutting off its access to trade, resources, and reinforcements. The city's only hope lay in its famous defenses, the Theodosian walls, the mightiest walls ever built by man. Yet, even as the siege began, Mehmed knew that sheer numbers wouldn't be enough to topple the walls. He needed innovation. And innovation is exactly what he brought. For the first time in history, Mehmed II deployed a weapon of unprecedented power, the beylik, a giant cannon, so massive that it could launch stones weighing over 600 pounds. The cannon was the largest ever constructed at the time, and its roar reverberated across the city. Yet, as powerful as the beylik was, it still wasn't enough to crack the ancient Theodosian walls. For days, Mehmed's forces pounded the defenses, but they held firm. The siege dragged on, and it looked like the Byzantine defenders, led by Emperor Constantine XI Palaiologos, might just pull through. But Mehmed wasn't just relying on brute force. He had a few tricks up his sleeve. You see, the Byzantines had another defense up their, sleeve. Greek fire, a deadly incendiary weapon capable of igniting ships and anything else it touched, was their secret weapon. The Byzantines used it in their naval defenses, setting the waters around Constantinople ablaze to keep Mehmed's fleet at bay. The Ottomans found themselves fighting not just an army but a fire that could sink their ships and burn their supplies. But Mehmed, the brilliant strategist, wasn't done yet. Faced with the Byzantine chain blockade blocking the entrance to the Golden Horn, a critical waterway, he pulled off a military maneuver so daring, it would become the stuff of legend. He had his ships dragged over land, bypassing the chain completely, and launching his fleet into the harbor from an unexpected direction. It was an audacious move that caught the defenders completely off guard. The city's defenses were now being attacked from both land and sea, two fronts that the Byzantines couldn't hold for much longer. By May 29, 1453, after nearly 2 months of intense siege, the walls were breached. The final assault was swift and brutal. The Ottomans poured into the city, overrunning the remaining defenses. And just like that, after over a millennium, the Byzantine Empire was no more. But it wasn't just the city that fell, it was a turning point in history. Mehmed didn't just win a battle, he changed the world. He entered Hagia Sophia, the greatest church of the Orthodox world, and did the unthinkable. He converted it into a mosque. Constantinople, the city that had stood as a bastion of Christianity and Roman glory, became the Ottoman capital, Istanbul. The fall of Constantinople sent shockwaves throughout the world. The Ottomans, once a modest power on the fringes of Europe, had now become an empire of immense influence. Istanbul wasn't just a new capital, it was the center of a global empire, bridging Europe and Asia, the heart of trade, culture, and power. The Ottomans had proven themselves unstoppable. They now controlled the key trade routes and held sway over vast territories. The Western world was reeling. Europe had already begun to seek new ways around Ottoman-controlled lands to avoid the looming Ottoman presence in the Mediterranean, and the echoes of this victory would ripple across the centuries. But here's where it gets interesting. As the Ottomans grew in power, they too would face limits. Every empire, no matter how strong, reaches a point where internal corruption, complacency, and external threats begin to crack at the foundations. The very strength that made them unstoppable now set the stage for challenges that no one, not even Mehmed II himself, could have predicted. Could the Ottomans maintain this momentum? Or would their own success eventually lead to their downfall? The answer, as history has shown, would be more complicated than anyone could have imagined. Let's fast forward to the year 1520. The Ottoman Empire is riding high, but there's one figure who will elevate it to unimaginable heights, Suleiman I, known to history as Suleiman the Magnificent. At just 26 years old, Suleiman ascended to the throne, but he wasn't just inheriting an empire, he was about to make it unstoppable. Under his leadership, the Ottomans would stretch their influence to its greatest territorial extent, covering lands from Hungary in the north, across North Africa, and all the way to the heart of the Arabian Peninsula. But it wasn't just military victories that defined Suleiman. No, his legacy was as much about culture as it was about conquest. One of his most lasting contributions to the empire was the construction of the Topkapi Palace, the new heart of Ottoman power. This palace wasn't just a residence for the Sultan, it was a symbol of Ottoman supremacy, a fortress of culture and politics. Suleiman's reign marked the peak of Ottoman splendor. The palace, with its towering gates and intricate courtyards, became a center of diplomacy, overseeing decisions that would shape the empire for centuries to come. Suleiman knew that in order to expand and sustain such a vast empire, he needed more than just military might, he needed a strong, centralized core. But military power would be the key to Suleiman's early success, and it wasn't just any army. The janissaries, the elite slave soldiers that had become the backbone of the Ottoman military, were the real muscle behind the empire's expansion. These soldiers weren't ordinary men, they were taken as children, usually from Christian families in conquered territories, and trained rigorously in the art of war. They were devoted, disciplined, and feared throughout the empire. By the time Suleiman took the throne, the janissaries were a well-oiled machine, unstoppable on the battlefield. Their loyalty wasn't just to the Sultan, it was to the empire itself. But there's a darker side to this elite corps. The very system that made them so powerful would also sow the seeds of the empire's future problems. As time went on, the janissaries grew more politically active, becoming a force that not only fought wars but also shaped the empire's politics. They resisted reforms, especially as the empire began to age and become more complex. And while they were once the symbol of Ottoman might, their growing power would soon turn into a problem. They'd begin to demand their own influence, challenging the Sultan's authority. The janissary system, once the backbone of Ottoman power, was slowly becoming a double-edged sword. Let's talk about one of the battles that solidified the Ottoman dominance in Europe, the Battle of Mohacs in 1526. The Hungarian army had long been a powerful force in Eastern Europe, but in this decisive battle, Suleiman's forces would obliterate them. The Ottomans didn't just defeat the Hungarians, they annihilated them, forcing King Louis II of Hungary to flee the battlefield, only to die in a tragic accident soon after. The victory at Mohacs was crucial in establishing Ottoman power in Central Europe, opening the door for future expansions into the heart of Europe. It wasn't just about winning a battle, it was about sending a message: the Ottoman Empire was now the dominant force in Europe. With victories like Mohacs, Suleiman secured his place as one of the greatest sultans in history. His reign was an era of expansion, wealth, and power. The Ottoman Empire, at its peak, was a force unlike any other. Yet, this peak, as we know, was also the beginning of the empire's eventual decline. Why? Because with greatness often comes complacency. When you're at the top, there's a tendency to rest on your laurels, and Suleiman's empire was no exception. Internal corruption began to take root, and while Suleiman himself remained a visionary leader, the cracks in the empire started to show. As the Ottomans expanded, so did the challenges. Managing a vast empire with many different peoples, religions, and cultures proved to be more difficult than the sultans anticipated. Even the janissaries, once a model of discipline, began to resist the changes necessary to keep the empire modern. Suleiman's death in 1566 marked the end of the golden age of the Ottoman Empire. The empire reached its peak during his reign, but after him, things began to unravel. Successors weren't as strong or visionary. Corruption within the palace grew, and the once unified empire began to fragment. The military, which had once been unstoppable, started to lose its edge. The janissaries, once loyal warriors, became a political force unto themselves. And the very system that had once made the Ottomans great now stood in the way of their future. The seeds of decline had been sown, but for now, the Ottomans were still at the top of their game. They were still a force to be reckoned with. However, in the world of empires, history is never static. What goes up must come down. And the road to that decline had already begun. After decades of unparalleled success, the Ottoman Empire was beginning to feel the weight of its own power. The cracks, subtle at first, were starting to show. From the outside, the empire was still vast, but within its borders, things were changing. The Ottomans had reached their peak, but as history often proves, what goes up must eventually come down. Let's start with a moment that would forever alter the balance of power in the Mediterranean, the Battle of Lepanto in 1571. The Ottomans, once the undisputed masters of the seas, met their first major naval defeat in a battle that would become a turning point in European history. The Holy League, a coalition of forces led by Venice, Spain, and the Papal States, faced off against the Ottoman fleet in one of the largest naval engagements of the century. The Ottomans, led by Ali Pasha, had a powerful fleet. But the Holy League, led by Don Juan of Austria, managed to exploit weaknesses in the Ottoman command and strategy. In a fierce, bloody clash, the Ottoman fleet was shattered. This defeat wasn't just a loss of ships, it was a blow to Ottoman prestige and their dominance over the Mediterranean. For the first time in centuries, the Ottomans realized they were not invincible on the seas. The Holy League's victory would shift the balance of naval power in Europe for generations to come, and the Ottomans would never fully recover their former maritime dominance. Now, the Ottomans weren't just fighting external enemies, they were facing internal problems that would grow worse with each passing year. In 1683, the Ottomans launched their second major attempt to conquer Vienna, Austria, one of the most important cities in Europe. This was no ordinary siege, it was a monumental effort to expand Ottoman control into the heart of Europe. But this time, the Ottomans were met with fierce resistance. The Polish Winged Hussars, a legendary cavalry force, joined forces with Austria and Germany, and together they formed a coalition that would push the Ottomans back. The siege, which lasted for 2 months, ended in disaster for the Ottomans. Not only was the Ottoman army defeated, but their retreat marked the beginning of a long period of decline in Europe. The Ottomans would never again threaten Vienna, and the siege represented a major turning point in the empire's fortunes. The once unstoppable Ottoman military was now reeling, unable to expand further into Europe. But it wasn't just military defeats that were undermining the empire. The janissaries, once the elite warriors that helped the Ottomans build their empire, were now part of the problem. They had been recruited as children, trained as soldiers, and were fiercely loyal to the Sultan. However, by the 17th century, their influence had grown far beyond the battlefield. No longer just soldiers, the janissaries had become a political force, meddling in imperial decisions and opposing any reforms that threatened their power. Their resistance to change became one of the most dangerous internal forces within the empire. The janissaries, who once fought to protect the sultan, now rebelled against him, sometimes even forcing sultans to abdicate. They had become an institution unto themselves, and their political power often clashed with the needs of the empire. The once feared janissaries had become a corrupt, resistant force that stood in the way of progress, stifling efforts to modernize and adapt to the changing world. On top of this, the empire was facing a severe economic crisis. The rise of European colonial powers, Spain, Portugal, England, and France, began to shift the global trade routes. The Silk Road, which had once been the lifeline of the Ottoman economy, was no longer as vital as it once was. As European colonial powers gained control over sea routes, the Ottomans found themselves losing influence over trade, which had been one of their most powerful assets. Their once prized middleman position between East and West became irrelevant in the face of the new, sea-based trade networks. As trade routes shifted, the Ottoman economy began to collapse. The empire lost its grip on its former wealth. The cities that once flourished as trade hubs began to stagnate, and the empire's treasury dwindled. The once great Ottoman military machine, fueled by the spoils of trade and conquest, began to lose its funding. The sultans, once the central figures of power, now struggled to maintain the loyalty of their subjects. Corruption was rampant, and the state apparatus became increasingly inefficient. The empire, which had once stood as the epitome of success, was now staring down the barrel of decay. By the end of the 17th century, the signs of imperial rot were everywhere. The Ottoman Empire, while still vast, was now beset by enemies from within and without. The loss of control over the seas, combined with internal resistance, would set the stage for centuries of decline. The empire that once spanned 3 continents was now crumbling under the weight of its own success and failure to adapt. The Ottoman Empire was in trouble. The cracks had formed, and they were beginning to widen. The Golden Age was over, and the empire was facing an uncertain future. For centuries, the Ottoman Empire had ruled over a vast, diverse, and dynamic population, Muslims, Christians, and Jews living under the same imperial banner. But by the 19th century, the empire was no longer the unstoppable force it had once been. The world was changing, and the Ottomans? They were struggling to keep up. European powers were rising, technology was advancing, and old empires that refused to modernize were being left behind. This was the age of revolutions. The Industrial Revolution had reshaped economies, new ideas about nationhood and self-rule were spreading, and the once mighty Ottomans found themselves in crisis. European diplomats had already coined a new term for the once mighty empire, the sick man of Europe. The Ottoman leadership knew they couldn't survive without change. In 1839, Sultan Mahmud II and his successors launched a bold reform movement known as the Tanzimat Reforms, an ambitious effort to modernize the empire in the style of the Western powers. For nearly 4 decades, the Ottomans tried to reform everything. The military was overhauled with Western-style training and organization. The legal system was restructured, adopting European-inspired laws instead of strict Islamic rule. New schools were built, replacing the old madrasa system, educating bureaucrats in Western sciences and governance. Infrastructure projects, including railways and telegraphs, were introduced to strengthen state control. At first, the changes looked promising. There was hope that the empire could transform itself into a modern state, capable of competing with the likes of Britain, France, and Russia. But the reality? The Tanzimat reforms were too little, too late. The empire was still deeply corrupt, and many of these changes never reached the people who needed them most. What the reforms did succeed in doing, however, was alienating both conservatives and reformists. Traditionalists saw the Tanzimat as a betrayal of Islamic values, while reformers believed they didn't go far enough. The empire was now trying to walk 2 paths at once, clinging to its old imperial structure while pretending to modernize. And that contradiction would prove fatal. While the Ottomans were struggling to fix their own internal mess, European colonial powers were carving up the world, and the empire was losing its grip on key territories. No loss was more devastating than Egypt. For centuries, Egypt had been one of the most important provinces of the empire, its economic and military backbone. But in the 1880s, Egypt became the ultimate prize for Britain and France. The reason? The Suez Canal, the new trade route that connected Europe to Asia, making it the most valuable waterway on the planet. The Ottomans were still Egypt's nominal rulers, but they had little real control. Egypt had been under the rule of Muhammad Ali's dynasty, a semi-independent Ottoman governor who had already modernized Egypt's military and economy far beyond the Ottomans themselves. The British and French had lent Egypt massive loans to build the Suez Canal, but when Egypt couldn't pay them back, the Europeans took over. In 1882, Britain sent its army into Egypt, crushing a nationalist uprising and installing direct British control. The Ottomans, humiliated, could do nothing. The message was clear: the empire was no longer a major player in world politics. For centuries, the Ottoman Empire thrived on diversity. It ruled over Arabs, Greeks, Armenians, Slavs, and countless other ethnic and religious groups. But now, the same diversity that had once been its strength was becoming a weakness. The 19th century saw the rise of nationalism, the idea that people of the same ethnicity, culture, and language should have their own independent nations. And for many subjects of the empire, Ottoman rule was no longer acceptable. The Balkans were the first to erupt. In the early 1800s, Greece, Serbia, and Bulgaria rebelled against Ottoman rule, demanding independence. The empire had once kept these regions in check, but now, Europe backed their revolutions. The Greeks, inspired by their ancient past, revolted in the 1820s, gaining their independence with the help of Britain, France, and Russia. Serbia soon followed, and by the late 19th century, the Ottoman grip on the Balkans was slipping fast. It wasn't just the Christians. Even Muslim-majority regions, from Algeria to Egypt to the Arab heartlands, began questioning Ottoman rule. In an ironic twist, the empire that once united different peoples was now being torn apart by the very identities it had ruled over for centuries. By the dawn of the 20th century, the writing was on the wall. The empire, once feared and respected, was now a shadow of its former self. European powers mocked it as the sick man of Europe. The economy was collapsing, nationalist uprisings were spreading like wildfire, and foreign powers controlled key Ottoman territories. The empire had tried to adapt, but every move only seemed to accelerate its decline. And then, the final disaster came: the First World War. The Ottoman Empire would be dragged into one last, desperate fight, a war that it would not survive. The empire that had once conquered Constantinople, that had once ruled over 3 continents, that had terrified Europe for centuries, was now on the edge of destruction. The 20th century would bring one last chapter, and it would end with the fall of the Ottomans, once and for all. For over 6 centuries, the Ottoman Empire had stood as one of the greatest powers in history. It had seen the rise and fall of European kingdoms, conquered mighty cities, and shaped entire civilizations. But by the early 20th century, the empire was barely holding itself together. It was weak, fractured, and bleeding territory by the day. The Ottomans had been called the sick man of Europe for decades. And now, they were about to take their final breath. When World War I erupted in 1914, the Ottoman Empire faced an impossible choice: stay neutral and risk invasion, or pick a side and hope for survival. The Ottomans ultimately threw in their lot with Germany and Austria-Hungary, hoping an alliance with the Central Powers would give them a chance to reclaim lost lands and revive their declining empire. It was a gamble, and a disastrous one. From the very start, the Ottomans found themselves overwhelmed. Their economy was too weak to sustain a long war, their military was outdated, and their empire was too large and unstable to control. Instead of gaining power, the war only accelerated their collapse. One of the most significant battles of the war was the Gallipoli Campaign, 1915, where British and Anzac forces attempted to invade Ottoman territory in a bid to open a new front. Against all odds, the Ottomans, led by Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, defended Gallipoli with fierce resistance, dealing the British a humiliating defeat. It was a rare victory for the Ottomans, but it came at a cost, thousands of lives lost, and the empire still on the brink of destruction. While the Ottomans were busy fighting European powers, another threat emerged, this time from within their own empire. For centuries, the Ottoman Empire had ruled over the Arab world, from modern-day Iraq to Palestine, Syria, and the Arabian Peninsula. But by the early 20th century, Arab nationalists had grown tired of Ottoman rule. They saw the empire as a foreign oppressor, and they wanted independence. Then T. Lawrence, better known as Lawrence of Arabia, came into the picture. A British intelligence officer, Lawrence helped ignite the Arab revolt, supplying Arab rebels with weapons, money, and military training. Arab forces, led by figures like Sharif Hussein of Mecca, launched attacks against Ottoman garrisons, blowing up railways, sabotaging supply lines, and capturing key cities like Aqaba. The Ottomans, already stretched thin, couldn't stop the rebellion. Their empire was crumbling from the inside. Then came the biggest betrayal. While Arab rebels fought alongside the British, they were promised independence once the Ottomans were defeated. But behind closed doors, Britain and France had other plans. In 1916, the infamous Sykes-Picot Agreement was signed, a secret deal between Britain and France to carve up the Middle East for themselves after the war. The Ottoman Empire was dying, and the Western powers were already dividing up its remains. 1918, the empire is defeated. By 1918, the war was over, and the Ottomans had lost. Allied forces, led by Britain and France, occupied key Ottoman territories, including Istanbul, the heart of the empire. The Ottoman government, realizing it had no more options, surrendered. The empire, once the greatest in the world, was now officially dead. But its fall wasn't just about war. It was about something deeper. The Ottomans had failed to modernize fast enough. They had lost control over trade, technology, and military advancements. Their inability to adapt to a changing world had sealed their fate. Even after the war, there was one last act to play. The Ottomans were defeated, but technically, they still existed, on paper. The Sultan was still in Istanbul, powerless but present. That was until one man finished the job. Mustafa Kemal Ataturk. The same commander who had defended Gallipoli in 1915 had now risen to power, leading a revolutionary movement to abolish the Ottoman Sultanate once and for all. In 1922, Ataturk officially abolished the Ottoman monarchy, ending over 6 centuries of imperial rule. 1 year later, he established the Republic of Turkey, a modern, secular nation built from the ashes of the Ottoman Empire. And just like that, after 623 years, the Ottoman Empire ceased to exist. Empires rise. Empires fall. But few shaped history like the Ottomans did. They ruled over 3 continents at their height. They redefined warfare, governance, and culture for centuries. They gave the world architectural wonders, scientific advancements, and one of the most diverse empires in history. Their end was inevitable, but their impact remains eternal. The empire may be gone, but its influence still lingers in the modern world. For more than 6 centuries, the Ottoman Empire ruled over vast lands, shaping the world in ways few empires ever could. It rose from a small band of warriors in Anatolia, conquered mighty cities, and built a legacy that still echoes across continents. But like all great empires, its time eventually ran out. Yet, an empire's true power isn't measured by how long it lasted, it's measured by what it left behind. The Ottomans may be gone, but their legacy is everywhere. Walk through Istanbul, and you'll see it in the Hagia Sophia, the Blue Mosque, and Topkapi Palace, masterpieces of Islamic and Byzantine architecture. These aren't just buildings, they are symbols of the empire's grandeur, standing as a reminder of its artistic and cultural achievements. You can taste their influence in Turkish cuisine, the rich spices, the kebabs, the coffee culture that spread across Europe and the Middle East. Even the bureaucratic and legal systems of modern-day Turkey and many Middle Eastern nations trace their roots back to Ottoman governance. And politically, the borders drawn after the Ottoman collapse still define the Middle East and the Balkans today. Conflicts, alliances, and cultural identities across these regions are still shaped by Ottoman rule, for better or worse. But here's the real question. Could the Ottomans have survived? Could better reforms, a stronger economy, or a different leadership path have saved them? Or was their fall inevitable, a fate sealed by time, modernization, and the relentless march of history? What do you think? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Was the fall of the Ottomans destiny or avoidable? Let's discuss, and while you're at it, don't forget to like and subscribe for more.